Were you watching the keynote back in October when Apple revealed the M1 Pro and the M1 Max? Did you also think,
I want more power, more cores, more of everything?
you might not have to wait that long, because we have got some new information from very reliable leaker DylanDKT that says that we might just get a more powerful Apple Silicon chip as soon as this spring. So in today's video, sit back, get subscribed, leave a like down below. We have got a lot to talk about. So before we hop into this, I just want to let you guys know that if you're interested in hearing more on this topic, you should tune in to today's episode of the Dark Mode podcast, which is my podcast that I run here on the channel with longtime friend Noah Rubin. I've got a playlist linked over there, and you can find Dark Mode on most major podcasting platforms. Now, let's get into it. Yeah, that's right, folks. We just got the new M1 Pro and M1 Max chips back in October of 2021, but Apple is showing no signs of slowing down. In fact, they're showing signs of speeding up, which is honestly a good thing, because it took almost a year between the M1 and the M1 Pro/Max. So hopefully Apple is going to accelerate their cycle a little bit in terms of rolling out these chips. And the thing that's really exciting to me is I was a little bit nervous, in all honesty, when the M1 Pro and the M1 Max came out, because the general assumption that we have all been making, which I think is very fair, is that those chips would continue to be rolled out in Apple's second-tier performance class devices. So that would be, a higher-end Mac Mini, a larger iMac, and the larger MacBook Pros. But what we didn't really know was whether Apple was just going to leave the M1 Pro and the M1 Max exactly as they are and just put them in those additional products. And I made a video talking about why that could have some problems for them, especially now with Intel and AMD coming out with some really insanely powerful hardware, and Apple trying to reuse the M1 Max in, actual desktop class computers. They could run into some competition issues, but fortunately, it seems like, to at least some degree, there will be an additional configuration for the upcoming larger 27-inch iMac. So let's talk about the leak. So this comes from leaker DylanDKT, who I've talked to a bunch of times. He's a really nice guy. He's got really credible info, and he's not, a showboat. He's just telling us what he's got, and he doesn't try to make any inferences with things that he doesn't have information on. And that's all really good qualities that you want to see in someone who is leaking information. So here's the leak. Dylan says that he has received confirmation that there will be an additional configuration for the upcoming iMac Pro beyond M1 Max. A 12-core CPU configuration was tied to a snippet of code referencing the iMac. He also notes that the internal naming candidate is iMac Pro for a reason. It is targeted towards pros. And this is really, really good news. This basically answers the concern that I had, which was essentially the M1 Max is impressive for a laptop chip with that power consumption, but once you put it in a desktop, it's honestly not class competitive with other desktop chips, even if it does use significantly less power. A 27-inch iMac is a really great form factor for Apple to expand upon the M1 Max, because you're not limited as much by power consumption. Now, my first question upon reading this was, okay, so if there's a configuration that has an additional 2 performance cores, bringing it up to 12, what does that mean for the graphics? So I spoke to Dylan, and he says that he believes there would be additional GPU cores. Now, what exactly does that mean? How many would there be? Is it another 2? Well, I think the best bet would be another 8 GPU cores, because if you look at the breakdown in M1 Pro and M1 Max, the GPUs are arranged in clusters of 8 cores. So when you get the binned 24-core M1 Max, it has 1 cluster disabled, and that's how you get to that figure. So this would be most likely a 40-core GPU, if I'm correct. As far as what this means for performance improvements, well, I mean, you could sort of extrapolate that out a little bit and say, okay, the performance core difference should be about the same as the 8 to the 10 performance core version of the M1 Pro, right? That would make sense in terms of scaling. However, I think there's another thing that is going to play a part here, and that is, as I was mentioning, the larger footprint means you can have a different thermal management system. So the constraints of a laptop form factor don't necessarily have to apply here, and I wouldn't be surprised if the new iMac is more powerful than the MacBook Pros, even with the same chips, because it can just pump a little bit more power into them. So I'm really interested to hear your guys' thoughts on this particular rumor. Do you think it would make sense for Apple to announce a 12-core CPU, 40-core GPU variant of the M1 Max? Perhaps they could call it the M1 Max Plus. God, they've really put themselves in a box with this naming scheme. What do you call this thing? If this does exist, a 12-core, 40-core version, do you just call it M1 Max with more cores? Do you call it M1 Max Plus? M1 Max Pro? Introducing the all-new MacPad Liquid XDR Plus minus M&69 mind explosion emoji. Okay, so real talk, what's my take on this leak? Well, I think it's consistent with what DylanDKT has been reporting for quite a while. All the way back when the M1 Pro first came out in October, he talked about how this would eventually make itself known in the iMac as well, and he said there might be an additional configuration. This is in line with that. He's saying, okay, now we might know what the additional configuration is. However, we have seen some pretty interesting information that suggests that Apple could deploy essentially an M1 Max Duo, and they could essentially combine the dies into 20 CPU cores and 64 GPU cores in the case of the M1 Max. Now, I don't necessarily think we should rule that out entirely. I think that's very likely what is going to happen in the Mac Pro, but we have no information that would say that that is or isn't going to happen in this iMac, and I would defer to Dylan's judgment because, he's the one with the information. But there are a number of people that are expressing some skepticism, saying maybe they'll go for the M1 Max Duo instead. And that, honestly sounds pretty freaking crazy. 20 CPU cores, 64 GPU, that's a big boy. And that would have 128 gigabytes of unified memory most likely as well. So, that could be some serious horsepower. The other thing I'm not so sure about is whether bumping up with 2 additional performance and 8 additional graphics cores is going to be enough. Because, we're talking about $2,000 to $3,000 desktops here. With a $2,000 to $3,000 budget in the PC world, you can get some truly ludicrous performance, like out of this world performance. And I don't know if the M1 Max, even when taken a step further, is going to be really enough to make it an iMac Pro or really competitive with other intense, expensive workstations. But I know what you guys are probably wondering about, and that is pricing. How much is this dang thing gonna cost? Well, here's the thing. Apple's pricing is a little bit weird because if you go and you look at the current Intel iMac, it starts at $1,799. In the case of the other iMac, they dropped the $1,099 base model that was, garbage, and they went with the $1,299, which is where the 4K iMac was. I think a similar thing could happen here. I think we're going to drop the $1,799 starting price and just go to $1,999, which is what they did with the 14-inch MacBook Pro. So I think your starting configuration is going to be a 27-inch mini LED ProMotion iMac with 10 plus 16 gigabytes of RAM, 512 gig SSD for $1,999. That's my guess. And that would be pretty interesting because that would mean spec for spec, the iMac would be a little bit less expensive than a comparable 16-inch MacBook Pro. So I think you'd probably be able to get into this super highly spec'd iMac for less than a fully maxed out MacBook Pro. Let me know your thoughts on how this pricing structure could work in the comments below. One other possibility is that Apple could go for a $22.99 starting price, but to me that seems like a bit of a jump from the 24-inch iMac, but it looks like we're not going to have to wait super long to figure all this out. That's a really exciting thing, is that this is probably going to be in March or April. And there's a very big reason for that, and that's that the M2 chip, which we've started to hear about, and is not expected to be a huge update, should be coming out later this year. But for one very important reason, and that is optics and timing, Apple would obviously want to get their M1 based products out before M2 comes out. Otherwise, that would just be like ridiculously confusing. So when we're talking about the Mac Mini and the larger screened iMac, expect to see those, in my opinion, before June. Mark Gurman is saying the same thing. He's saying that there's going to be a lot of hardware this year, and I think we should expect to see by WWDC all of the M1 products are launched or announced. And I'm including the Mac Pro in that because we've seen some information saying this year is Mac Pro year, and that to me means a launch or an announcement rather at WWDC, and then it would actually come out in like December, which is what they've done for the previous two Mac Pros as well as the iMac Pro. So I think that'll happen again. But I think by June of this year, we're going to have some really crazy stuff coming out. I think this is going to be a big year if you're trying to make a big purchase for a Mac. And it's also worth noting that Apple seems to be going on a TikTok cycle here, so I wouldn't expect a replacement to the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros. I don't think there's going to be an M2 Pro this year. If you're trying to make a decision on a 14 or a 16-inch MacBook Pro, the only thing that should be, informing that in terms of timing is whether you want to spend more money on a more powerful iMac or Mac Pro. You definitely don't have to worry about, buying a 14-inch now and then in 6 months there's an M2 Pro that comes out. It's just not going to happen. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that Apple has something planned here. I'm definitely excited to see what they come up with, but it's going to be a challenge for sure. You know what's not a challenge though? Leaving a like and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss any more uploads. If you're watching this on the day it comes out, make sure to stay tuned because we're going to be talking about this again tonight on my podcast Dark Mode. I'll have that linked in the description below if you want to check out the playlist. Definitely go ahead and check that out. As usual, I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a good one.